Everyone at school laughed and bullied a quiet, modest girl. They pushed her, humiliated her, and in the end, even choked her. But no one knew that this girl was the daughter of Ronda Rousey herself, the MMA legend. And when her mother appeared at the door, the bullies realized they had chosen the wrong victim. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The air in the small house still smelled faintly of fresh paint and cardboard boxes. Morning sunlight spilled through half-open blinds, touching the kitchen table where a single bowl of cereal sat untouched. Lakia McNamara sat quietly in front of it, her chin resting against her hand, staring at the clock ticking above the stove. The sound of wrapping tape peeling from another box carried from the hallway, followed by the heavy thud of a duffel bag hitting the floor. Her mother, Ronda Rousey, was moving at her usual relentless pace, already dressed in her training gear, her blonde hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. There was no hesitation in her movements. Every step was precise, purposeful, almost like she was inside an octagon again. "Eat, sweetheart," Ronda said without looking up as she checked the contents of her bag. Gloves, tape, a water bottle. She never left without her essentials. "You've got a long day, new school, new start." Lakia looked down at the cereal, stirred the spoon once, and forced herself to take a bite. Her stomach was knotted with nerves, but she didn't want her mother to see. Ronda had enough weight on her shoulders already. For weeks she had been juggling schedules, traveling back and forth, signing contracts and arranging fights. Moving here had been Ronda's decision, one made with the sharp clarity of someone used to surviving by choices under pressure. But for Lakia, it meant leaving behind familiar hallways, the two friends she trusted, and the quiet corner of her old library where she had felt invisible and safe. Now invisibility would be harder to find. "Mom," she finally said softly, pushing the cereal aside. "What if they don't like me?" Ronda paused, zipping her bag. For a moment her strong shoulders softened, and she crouched down so that her eyes were level with her daughter's. Ronda's gaze was sharp, but in it burned a tenderness Lakia always relied on when the world felt too big. "They don't have to like you," she said. "You just have to be yourself. Remember what I told you. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Don't pick fights, don't show off, just focus on school. You're stronger than you think." Lakia gave a small nod. She wanted to believe her mother, wanted to hold on to that certainty. But she wasn't like Ronda. Where her mother was a storm-fast, explosive, commanding, she was quiet, thoughtful, and fragile in ways she hated to admit. People noticed her face before they noticed her voice, and that attention always felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. She longed to be ordinary, to slip through the hallways unnoticed, to be the kind of girl who read books and was left alone. The drive to Riverton High was short, only 10 minutes from the modest house they now called home. The streets were lined with golden autumn leaves, branches stretching toward the pale sky. As they pulled up to the school, the red brick building loomed tall, its wide windows reflecting the morning sun. Students streamed through the gates, laughter and shouts carrying across the yard. Basketball jerseys hung loosely over broad shoulders. Cheerleader skirts swayed as girls clustered together, and groups of boys slapped each other on the back, the sound echoing like small explosions of camaraderie. It was a world that seemed to already have rules, alliances, and hierarchies set in stone, and Lakia felt like an outsider before she even stepped out of the car. Ronda put the car in park and turned to her daughter. "Remember," she said, her tone steady, "stay calm. You don't need to prove your strength here. Not to them. Just keep your head down and do what you came to do." Lakia clutched the straps of her old backpack, worn at the corners from years of use. It was the kind of bag that would draw stares in a place where everyone seemed to have something new, something shiny. She swallowed hard and whispered, "Okay." She wanted to ask her mother to walk her in, to be the shield she knew she could be. But she also knew how that would look, and the last thing she wanted was to stand out more than she already would. As soon as she stepped through the gates, the noise of the school hit her like a wave. It wasn't just loud, it was alive, chaotic, competitive, with an undercurrent of energy that made her heart race. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, keeping her eyes down, trying not to meet the stares she felt sliding over her. A group of boys near the lockers stopped talking as she passed, their whispers sharp enough to reach her ears. "Who's the new girl?" one said, and another chuckled. "Looks like she raided a thrift store." The laughter that followed made her cheeks burn. She quickened her steps, clutching her backpack closer, as if the fabric could shield her. The first bell rang, echoing through the hallways, and students surged inside. Laakia found her classroom, slipping into the back row before anyone could stop her. She sat down, pulling out her notebook, the one her father had given her before he passed. Its edges were frayed, the leather cover scratched, but inside were words she often returned to, reminders of strength, of patience, of control. Her father had believed in discipline, in the art of fighting not to destroy but to protect. She traced one of his old notes with her finger, the words a whisper across time. "True strength is knowing when not to use it." The teacher began class, but Laakea barely heard. Her thoughts were heavy, bouncing between the noise of the hallways and the weight of her mother's words. She tried to focus, tried to sink into the comfort of anonymity, but even here she could feel eyes on her. A girl in the second row turned to glance back, lips curling into a smirk before she leaned to whisper something to her friend. They both laughed softly. Laakea pretended not to notice, her stomach twisting tighter. When the final bell rang for lunch, she hesitated before stepping into the cafeteria. The room was buzzing with voices, the clatter of trays, the squeak of sneakers against the polished floor. Tables were filled with groups, laughter spilling from every corner. She searched for an empty spot, something tucked away where no one would pay attention to her. She found one in the far corner, set her tray down quietly, and began eating her sandwich in small bites, each chew heavy with awareness of the crowd around her. She thought of her mother then, training at that very moment, probably surrounded by fighters, coaches, the smell of sweat and resin in the air. Ronda belonged in that world, strong and respected. Laakea felt like the opposite, shrinking smaller and smaller in a place where survival seemed to depend on loudness, boldness, and power. She told herself she could endure it. She had to. She had promised her mother she wouldn't cause trouble, and she intended to keep that promise. When the day finally ended, Laakea walked home alone, her shoulders hunched against the cold wind. The streets were quiet, leaves scattering across the pavement, but her mind was loud with echoes of whispers and laughter. At home, she climbed the stairs to her room, pulled out her notebook, and wrote a single line on the first page. "First day at Riverton High. They already noticed me." She stared at the words for a long time, chewing on her lip, then closed the notebook and placed it back into her backpack. Through the walls, she could hear the faint rhythm of her mother's fists hitting the heavy bag, the sound steady, powerful, like a heartbeat that never faltered. Laakea curled into her blanket, wishing she could inherit that certainty, that unshakable strength. But she wasn't her mother, not yet. She was just a quiet girl in a new school, desperately trying to stay invisible. And yet, deep inside her, a small ember smoldered, one that no amount of fear or ridicule could completely extinguish. She didn't want to fight, but she knew, if pushed far enough, she had the blood of a fighter running through her veins. Riverton High didn't know that yet. They only saw a shy girl with downcast eyes and an old backpack. But one day, whether she wanted it or not, they would discover that under the silence lived the daughter of Ronda Rousey. The next morning, Laakea woke with the same knot of dread in her stomach that had twisted inside her the day before. The notebook still sat at the edge of her desk, closed tightly as though the single sentence she had written in it carried enough weight to choke her. She moved slowly, dragging herself through the motions of getting ready, tying her hair back neatly, smoothing the front of her jacket as if that small act of care might help her armor herself against the day ahead. Downstairs, her mother was already gone, the faint echo of the front door closing an hour earlier, still lingering in the silence. There was a note on the counter. Rhonda's strong handwriting slanted slightly as though written in haste. "Be strong, sweetheart. I'll see you tonight. Don't forget who you are." Laakea tucked the note into her backpack, along with her books, and stepped outside. The walk to Riverton High was colder that morning, a thin layer of frost lining the edges of the grass along the sidewalk. She kept her head down as she walked through the gates, but it did little to shield her from the noise that seemed to amplify as soon as she entered. The laughter of students, the loud bragging of athletes, the sharp giggles of cheerleaders, it all rushed together until it felt like it pressed against her skin. She hugged her books closer, silently wishing she could melt into the walls. It was almost inevitable that someone would notice her again. She could feel eyes tracking her even as she tried to slip unnoticed into the current of students. That was when she saw them clearly for the first time, the group that seemed to own the hallways more than any teacher or principal ever could. At the center was a boy taller than most of the others, his build broad, his dark hair cut short in a style that was meant to look casual but clearly took time. His name was whispered among the students around her, Jake, captain of the wrestling team, a boy who carried his confidence like armor and expected everyone to bow beneath it. Beside him were two shadows, his closest friends. One was leaner, always smirking, the kind of boy who seemed to enjoy cruelty as though it were a joke. The other was bulkier, his silence more threatening than laughter, the kind who would follow orders without question and enjoy the power of it. Leaning against the lockers with them was a girl, her blonde curls perfectly styled, her nails tapping against her phone with a rhythm that seemed to declare her boredom with everything around her. She glanced up at Lakia with narrowed eyes, then whispered something to Jake that made the entire group laugh. Lakia kept walking, her heart beating faster. She heard the words clearly, though they were said with the mocking softness of someone who wanted her to hear. "She looks like she found that jacket in a thrift store." The laughter that followed was loud, cutting through the chatter of the hallway. Her ears burned hot, but she forced her steps to remain steady, kept her eyes on the ground, and walked faster toward her classroom. In English class, she sat in the same back corner as before, hoping the shadows would swallow her whole. The teacher's voice droned on, and Lakia tried to lose herself in her father's notebook again, tracing the words he had left her, clinging to them as though they could shield her from the world outside those pages. But the whispers never stopped. She could feel them brushing against her like nettles, tiny pricks of mockery. A giggle here, a snicker there. A note passed between desks that made half the row glance at her and laugh. She stared harder at the notebook, willing herself not to react, not to give them what they wanted. By lunchtime, she was exhausted. She carried her tray through the cafeteria, the noise booming around her like the roar of a stadium. She searched for a quiet corner, somewhere to hide, but as soon as she sat down, the scrape of a chair across from her made her freeze. Jake dropped his tray on the table with a thud, smirking at her as soda splashed out onto the surface. His friend sat beside him, flanking her like guards of mockery, while the blonde girl leaned her chin on her hand, her eyes sparkling with cruelty. "So," Jake said, biting into his slice of pizza with exaggerated slowness. "New girl thinks she can sit alone, huh? Doesn't work that way here. You fit in or you don't." Lakia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tray. She didn't answer. The girl tilted her head, letting her eyes slide over Lakia's jacket. "This fabric," she said sweetly, "is that polyester? Maybe you could use it as a cleaning rag when it falls apart." Her laughter rang out sharp and high, the kind of sound that made everyone nearby look over and grin. One of Jake's friends reached across the table suddenly and snatched the book Lakia had just set beside her tray. He flipped through it, his smirk growing. "What's this? Fairy tales? Dragons? She's a little princess." He held it above his head as she stood quickly, reaching for it. But Jake blocked her with a hand on her shoulder, pressing her back into the seat. "Careful," Jake drawled. "She might scratch." His friends laughed loudly, the sound like knives cutting into her. Her sandwich had slipped from her tray, the bread crumbling on the floor as the apple rolled under the table. She crouched down quickly, her hands shaking, gathering what was left. Her throat burned with humiliation, but she said nothing, not a word. The bell rang suddenly and she seized the chance to escape, rushing out of the cafeteria, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might split. She didn't stop until she reached the far end of the hallway, where no one else lingered. She pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her shoulders trembling. It wasn't fear, it was anger, hot and heavy, pulsing in her veins like fire. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, and pressed her forehead against her knees. She thought of her mother's words. Stay calm, don't fight back. Keep your head down. And she thought of her father's. Strength is knowing when not to use it. But both felt like chains that bound her as she shook under the weight of mockery. Later that afternoon during gym class, she tried to disappear at the back of the line. The basketball rolled across the floor, stopping at her feet. Naomi, throw it back! One of the girls sneered, using the wrong name deliberately, her voice dripping with disdain. Laakia picked up the ball and tossed it back in a single fluid motion, her muscles remembering precision. The throw was sharp, controlled, almost perfect. For a moment the laughter faltered, Brittany flinching as the ball cut past her too closely. But then she covered her unease with a laugh. Oh, she can throw! Who knew? The others joined in, the sound grating against Laakia's ears. She turned away, her heart racing. She hadn't meant to show anything, hadn't meant to let her instincts slip. But years of training, years of her father's voice correcting her stance and teaching her to focus, were buried deep inside her muscles. It wasn't something she could erase, even when she wanted to. That evening, she walked home under a sky painted with streaks of fading orange and purple. The apartment was empty, the silence heavy. She sat at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote with hands that trembled. Day 2. They laugh louder. They think I'm weak, but I'm holding back. She paused, staring at the words until they blurred, then closed the notebook and rested her forehead against its cover. Her palms still stung with the memory of clenching into fists, of the urge to fight. But she hadn't. She had endured, and for now that was the only victory she could claim. She lay in bed that night, the sound of the city outside her window fading into a hum. She thought of her mother, sweating in some gym miles away, fists striking against a heavy bag with precision and power. She thought of her father's voice, soft but firm, telling her that control was the real strength. But lying there in the darkness, Laakia wasn't sure how long she could keep holding back. Riverton High had seen her silence. Tomorrow they would test it again, and she knew, deep in her chest, that the storm was only beginning. The third day at Riverton High began with a deceptive calm. The sky above the red brick school glowed with the pale light of early morning, the maple leaves scattered like fire across the pavement. Laakia walked slowly through the gates, clutching her backpack straps until her knuckles turned white. Her head was low, but her steps were steadier than the day before. She had endured 2 days already, 2 long stretches of whispered laughter, mocking eyes, and the sting of humiliation that clung to her like a second skin. Each night she had written in her father's notebook, each word a promise that she would endure, that she would not let anger make her reckless. But endurance was a heavy burden, and she felt its weight pressing harder with each passing hour. The hallway seemed louder that morning. A cluster of cheerleaders laughed as they passed, their perfume mixing with the smell of waxed floors and paper. Somewhere nearby, sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as a group of basketball players tossed a ball back and forth. Laakia tried to weave her way through the river of students, but she felt the ripple of attention almost immediately. Conversations quieted when she walked by, only to be replaced with hushed laughter or the smirk of someone nudging a friend to look at her. The same faces again and again, circling like vultures. Jake and his crew had marked her, and Riverton High was too small a world for her to escape their gaze. It began before the first bell even rang. When Laakia opened her locker, a slip of paper fell out, folded into a rough square. She picked it up with hesitant fingers, unfolding it to find 2 words scrawled in thick black ink. Weak doll. Her stomach twisted, and she shoved the note into her bag before anyone could see. But when she looked up, she saw Jake leaning against the lockers across the hall, his smirk sharp as a blade. He didn't need to say anything. The note had said enough. In class, the cruelty was quieter, but more cutting. During history, when the teacher turned to write on the board, Jake's friend Kyle whispered loud enough for half the room to hear, "Careful, don't break your pencil, princess." Snickers filled the row, and Laakia's hands shook as she tried to keep writing, the words on her page blurring. At one point she caught sight of Brittany, the blonde girl with perfect curls, turning in her seat to give Laakia a long, deliberate once-over. Brittany's lips curved into a smile that wasn't a smile at all, just the cruel satisfaction of someone watching their plan work. By lunch, the torment had grown bolder. When Laakia walked into the cafeteria, carrying her tray with its simple sandwich and apple, she felt the atmosphere shift. She had chosen a corner table the day before, but today that corner was already occupied by Jake, Ethan, and Kyle. Their trays sprawled across the table as if they had claimed it in her absence. Brittany sat on the edge of the bench, crossing her legs and smiling sweetly when Laakia stopped short. "Looking for your little hiding spot?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. "Sorry, it's taken." Laakia turned away quickly, moving to another table. But the damage was already done. Whispers followed her as she sat alone again, trying to eat while the laughter from Jake's table rang louder than the rest of the cafeteria combined. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to crumble. When she dropped her apple and it rolled across the floor, Brittany clapped her hands together dramatically and called out, "Oh no, did the princess drop her crown?" The cafeteria erupted into laughter, and Laakia's face burned hot. She bent down to retrieve the apple, her hair falling forward to hide the tears threatening her eyes. She bit her lip hard, refusing to let them see her cry. That afternoon, the torment escalated further, no longer content with whispers and mockery. In the hallway, Jake stopped her outright, planting himself in her path. Students slowed, forming a loose circle as though sensing a performance was about to unfold. "Hey, new girl," Jake said, his grin wide and malicious. "You know what you remind me of? One of those practice dummies we throw around in the gym. Just standing there taking it. You'd be perfect for wrestling drills." Ethan and Kyle laughed loudly, and before Laakia could step aside, Kyle grabbed her arm and twisted it lightly, mimicking a grappling move. He didn't apply real pressure, but the mocking was clear. "See? Just like a dummy," he said. She pulled her arm back quickly, her heart thudding, but the crowd was already laughing. Brittany pulled out her phone as if the moment was too good not to record, her smirk making Laakia's stomach churn. Laakia forced herself to walk away, ignoring the sting of their laughter that echoed behind her, like footsteps she couldn't escape. She slipped into the library, her only refuge, and sat at a corner table with her notebook open in front of her. But even there, the peace didn't last. A group of younger students at another table were whispering, casting glances her way. One of them giggled, mimicking the way Kyle had twisted her arm in the hallway. They hadn't even been there, but the story was already spreading like wildfire, twisted and reshaped with every retelling. Laakia's cheeks burned as she lowered her head over the page, trying to drown it all out by writing. Her pen scratched furiously against the paper. Day 3. They don't stop. They won't stop. They think I am their toy. I promised Mom I wouldn't fight. But how much longer can I endure before something inside me breaks? When she got home that evening, the apartment was quiet again. Her mother was still at the gym, her absence a heavy reminder of the sacrifices she made every day. Laakia sat at her desk staring at her hands, the calluses on her palms, the faint traces of old bruises across her knuckles, told a story no one at Riverton High knew. She had spent years training beside her mother, years learning to strike, to grapple, to defend. But all of that was a secret, locked away behind her silence. To the students at school, she was just a fragile girl with downcast eyes and trembling hands. She pressed her fists against her knees and closed her eyes. She imagined her father's voice, steady and calm, saying what he had told her countless times in the old dojo. Control, Laakia. Never let anger decide for you. Strength without control is weakness. But as she sat there, the memory of Jake's smirk, Kyle's mocking grip, and Brittany's phone aimed at her like a weapon replayed again and again in her mind. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was shame and the unbearable weight of being powerless when she knew she wasn't. When her mother finally returned that night, sweaty and tired from training, Laakia didn't tell her what had happened. She couldn't. She saw the lines of exhaustion etched into Rhonda's face, the way her shoulders slumped as she dropped her gym bag by the door. Instead, Laakia forced a smile and said, "It was fine," when her mother asked about her day. But later, alone in her room, she wrote again in her notebook, I could break them. I could end this. But if I do, I break my promise to her. And if I don't, I break myself. Which is worse? She stared at the words until her vision blurred, until the letters swam together into something shapeless. Closing the notebook, she lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The laughter still echoed in her ears, louder than the silence of the room. She turned onto her side, curling into herself, and whispered into the darkness, "How much longer can I hold back?" The night stretched on endlessly, the hum of the city outside her window rising and falling like a tide. In her dreams, she saw herself back in the school hallway, surrounded by laughter, her arms pinned, her voice stolen. And behind the blur of mocking faces, she saw her mother, her expression unreadable. Was it disappointment? Was it pride? She couldn't tell. When she woke in the morning, her body was heavy with exhaustion, but something inside her felt sharper, tighter, like a string pulled to its breaking point. As she dressed and pulled her jacket tighter around her, she knew the torment at Riverton High was not going to fade. It was growing stronger every day, like a fire fed with fuel. And sooner or later, whether she wanted it or not, something inside her would ignite. By the end of the week, the quiet torment Laokia had been enduring transformed into something darker, heavier, and far more dangerous than mocking words or sly whispers. Her days at Riverton High now carried an air of constant expectation, as though every hallway, every classroom, and every lunch table were preparing to test her limits. She felt the shift the moment she stepped through the doors that Friday morning. The looks from other students weren't just curious anymore. They were hungry, hungry for a show, for the next cruel spectacle that Jake and his circle would create at her expense. Laokia felt it deep inside her chest, a warning throb in her pulse that today would be worse. She tried to keep her head down, gripping her backpack straps and repeating the words her mother had drilled into her. Stay calm, stay focused, don't give them a reason to push harder. But Riverton High was not a place where silence protected anyone. The predators smelled quietness as weakness, and weakness was fuel for their games. The morning dragged in suffocating tension. In class, Jake sat 2 rows ahead, his posture lazy, his arm draped over his chair, but his eyes flickered back to her with deliberate regularity. Every time she looked up from her notebook, his smirk was waiting. Brittany leaned against the edge of her desk, pretending to adjust her hair, but really aiming her phone camera in Laokia's direction. Ethan whispered something that made Kyle laugh loudly, their eyes flicking to her as if to remind her that she was the punchline. At lunch, she barely ate. The sandwich her mother had packed sat half-finished on her tray as she picked at the crust, trying to ignore the laughter that burst from Jake's table across the room. She left early, seeking the shelter of the library again, but even there she couldn't shake the awareness that her tormentors were circling. Their laughter had become a sound she carried with her like a shadow, pressing against her even when she was alone. The final bell rang, releasing students into the crisp afternoon air. Laokia gathered her books quickly, hoping to slip out unnoticed, but her hopes shattered when she felt the weight of a hand on her shoulder. She froze, her heart stuttering, before slowly turning. Jake stood there, towering above her, Ethan and Kyle flanking him with identical smirks. Brittany lingered just a few feet behind, phone already in her hand. "Hey, new girl," Jake drawled, his grip tightening slightly on her shoulder. "You're not in a hurry, are you? We've got something fun planned." Laokia's throat went dry. She forced her voice steady, though it came out thin. "I need to go home." Jake laughed, the sound low and mocking. "Don't worry, it won't take long. Just a little. Practice. Come on." He didn't wait for her agreement. He gave her a light shove forward, and his friends fell into step on either side of her. The hallway was thinning of students, but enough lingered to notice the way she was being herded, and whispers spread in their wake. Laokia wanted to scream, to run, but she knew if she did, it would only fuel their amusement. Her feet carried her unwillingly toward the gym, the echo of her sneakers against the polished floor sounding like the slow drumbeat of a march. The gym was nearly empty when they entered. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows, painting golden lines across the scuffed wooden floor. The faint smell of sweat and chalk still clung to the air, remnants of the basketball team's practice earlier. The silence inside was oppressive, amplifying the sound of their laughter as Jake closed the doors behind them. "Perfect place for a little training session," Jake said, tossing his bag to the side. "And look, we've got ourselves a live mannequin." He gestured toward Lakia, and Brittany laughed loudly, the sound sharp and cruel as she lifted her phone to start recording. Lakia's pulse hammered in her ears. She stepped back instinctively, clutching her backpack tighter against her chest. But Ethan moved quickly, grabbing it from her hands and tossing it aside. "Won't be needing this," he sneered. Kyle shoved her lightly toward the center of the gym. "Please," Lakia managed, her voice tight, her breath coming faster. "Don't!" Jake interrupted with a mocking tone. "Relax, princess. We're just playing around. You'll be fine. Maybe you'll even learn something." His grin widened as he lunged forward suddenly, catching her wrist. He twisted it in a crude imitation of a grappling move, forcing her arm up behind her back. Lakia gasped at the sharp pull, struggling to keep her footing as he spun her toward Ethan, who grabbed her other arm. "See? Just like a training dummy," Ethan laughed. "She doesn't even fight back." Brittany giggled from behind her phone, circling to capture every angle. "This is gold," she said. "The little doll's first wrestling lesson." Lakia's chest heaved. Panic and anger surged through her veins in equal measure. Every instinct screamed at her to react, to use the techniques drilled into her bones since childhood. She could feel the angles, the openings. If she shifted her weight, dropped her stance, she could break free. But her mother's voice echoed inside her. "Don't fight. Don't reveal who you are. Don't make trouble." So she bit her lip hard, her teeth drawing blood, and tried to endure. Jake wasn't satisfied. "Come on, that's too easy." He shoved her down onto the mat, and Kyle stepped forward, pinning her shoulders. "What do you think, chokehold?" Jake asked, his grin flashing toward his friends. "Let's see how long she lasts." Before she could react, his arm looped around her neck, squeezing. Lakia's eyes flew wide as the pressure closed in, her breath trapped in her throat. She clawed at his arm instinctively, her body jerking in protest, but the hold only tightened. Ethan laughed, cheering Jake on, while Brittany's phone captured every second. "Look at her face!" Ethan jeered. "She's turning red." Lakia's vision blurred, the edges of the gym darkening. Her chest burned as she fought for air, her legs kicking weakly against the mat. Her mind screamed for release, but the voices around her only grew louder, mocking, triumphant. She felt her strength slipping, her body going slack as consciousness began to fade. For one fleeting moment, as the world narrowed into a tunnel of darkness, she thought of her father's words. "When someone puts their hands on you, you have two choices: endure or act. But if they choke you, never let it happen twice." She wanted to act, wanted to tear free, to show them who she was, but her lungs begged for air, and the weight of her mother's warning kept her bound. Her fingers loosened, her body sagged, and her vision collapsed into black. The laughter around her faltered then. Ethan's jeers caught in his throat. Kyle's smirk faded. Even Brittany's camera wavered as Jake held her limp form, the reality of what they had done sinking in. "Dude," Ethan said nervously. "She's out. Let go, man." Jake's smirk faltered, but his pride held him stubbornly for a heartbeat longer. Then reluctantly, he released his grip, and Lakia's body slumped onto the mat with a soft thud. She didn't move. The silence in the gym was deafening now, broken only by her shallow, rasping breath. "Is she okay?" Kyle asked, his voice uncertain. Brittany lowered her phone, her face pale. "Maybe we went too far." Jake stood over Lakia's still form, his jaw tight, his bravado cracking under the weight of the moment. "She'll be fine," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. But the laughter was gone now, replaced by something heavier: fear, guilt, the creeping realization that their game had crossed a line that could not be erased. On the mat, Lakia's chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Her eyelids fluttered, but she remained lost somewhere between consciousness and the suffocating grip of darkness. She had endured, but at a cost. Her silence, her restraint, her promise to her mother, it had left her vulnerable. and the tormentors had proven that they would not stop until they had broken her completely. The gym doors remained closed, the golden light from the windows spilling across the floor, casting long shadows over the scene. The predators who had laughed only minutes ago now hovered uncertainly, their power tainted by the reality of what they had done. And Laia, fragile and gasping, lay on the mat as proof of just how far they were willing to go. The storm inside her had not erupted yet, but in the silence of that gym, in the breath that scraped from her throat as she fought to return to the world, something shifted. Somewhere deep in the darkness, beneath the fear and shame, the ember of a fighter smoldered hotter, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. The gym was heavy with silence after Laia's body hit the mat. The echoes of laughter snuffed out as quickly as a candle in the wind. Jake stepped back, his chest heaving slightly, his bravado shaken by the stillness of the girl sprawled before him. Brittany lowered her phone, her smirk collapsing into something uncertain, the shimmer of cruelty in her eyes flickering under the sudden weight of guilt. Ethan shifted his feet uneasily, glancing at Kyle, whose jaw had tightened as he realized the line they had crossed. For the first time in days, the group of tormentors felt the absence of control, the sudden chill of something spiraling beyond their reach. Laia's shallow breaths rasped against the mat, each one a desperate fight to remain tethered to consciousness. Her fingers twitched faintly, her eyelids fluttering as the fog of suffocation clouded her mind. In that half-world of dark and dim light, she thought she could hear her father's voice again, steady and calm as always. A lock is about control, Laia, not about destruction. If someone uses it on you, remember the choice it gives you, to forgive or to end. The words rippled across her thoughts like fading echoes, pulling her back toward the world of pain and noise. The sound that broke the gym's silence was not her gasp, nor Jake's nervous laugh, nor Brittany's trembling whisper. It was the heavy slam of the gym's double doors as they burst open, crashing against the walls with a crack that seemed to shatter the air itself. All four bullies turned in shock. In the doorway, framed by the golden light of the fading afternoon, stood Ronda Rousey. For a single suspended heartbeat, the scene froze. The legendary fighter's figure was unmistakable broad shoulders beneath a fitted jacket, strong arms tense at her sides, her blonde hair tied back, her eyes cold as steel. She took in the picture before her with a glance. Her daughter crumpled on the mat, her chest rising in fragile bursts, and the circle of teenagers looming above her with the unmistakable air of guilt. Something inside her snapped into place with frightening precision. She moved before anyone could speak, her stride cutting across the gym like a blade. Jake stepped back instinctively, his smirk faltering entirely as he stammered, "We were just..." But his words ended with a startled grunt as Ronda shoved him aside with a single, controlled movement, one that carried no wasted energy but enough power to send him staggering into the bleachers. She dropped to her knees beside Laia, her hands instantly assessing, one on her daughter's chest, another at her temple. Relief flickered through her eyes when she felt the faint rhythm of breath, though it was ragged. "Laia," she whispered, her voice both gentle and fierce. "Baby, can you hear me?" Her daughter stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering as a low moan escaped her lips. Ronda brushed a strand of hair back from her damp forehead, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and fear. Then she rose. She stood with the weight of an Olympic champion, with the aura of someone who had stepped into cages and arenas before crowds baying for blood, and had never once flinched. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, locked on the group of bullies. "Which one of you," she said, her voice low, dangerous in its calm, "thought it was smart to put your hands on my daughter?" No one spoke. Jake swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance collapsing under the weight of her presence. Brittany hid her phone behind her back, her lips parting soundlessly. Ethan glanced at Kyle, but both boys looked pale, their confidence evaporating. Ronda's gaze swept over them like a storm. "You think this is a game? You think choking a girl until she can't breathe is entertainment?" She took a step forward, and the boys instinctively took one back. "I've spent my entire life in this world. I know the difference between training and torture. You don't even understand the fire you're playing with." Jake tried to regain his composure, puffing his chest slightly, though his voice shook. We didn't mean. We weren't. Shut your mouth, Rhonda snapped, the sharpness of her tone cutting him off instantly. The authority in her voice, the kind that came not from words but from years of commanding respect inside cages and arenas, silenced him as if she had physically struck him. You've been bullying her since the moment she set foot in this school, haven't you? Her eyes narrowed, catching Brittany's trembling attempt to hide her phone. And you, recording it, laughing at it, you should be ashamed. Brittany's face flushed, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone. I was just, she stammered, but the excuse withered under Rhonda's unflinching stare. Rhonda's fists flexed once at her sides. She took a slow breath, reining in the instinct that screamed for her to crush these children into the mat as punishment. But she wasn't here as the fighter the world knew. She was here as a mother. Her daughter had almost been broken before her eyes. That alone was enough to make her voice thunder, even as it stayed steady. Listen carefully, she said, her gaze fixed on Jake and his cronies. If any one of you so much as looks at her the wrong way again, if you breathe in her direction with anything less than respect, I will make sure you understand pain in a way you will never forget. And I won't need an octagon or a referee to do it. The silence that followed was suffocating. The boys shifted uncomfortably, their bravado utterly shattered. Brittany's eyes brimmed with tears, her mask of superiority finally slipping. Rhonda turned back to her daughter, kneeling once more and helping Laakia sit up. Her daughter coughed weakly, clutching at her throat, tears slipping down her cheeks. Mom, she whispered hoarsely, shame dripping from every syllable. I couldn't. I didn't fight back. I couldn't stop them. Rhonda pulled her into her arms, her voice softening into a murmur meant only for her. Shh, you're safe now. You don't have to be ashamed. You're not weak, baby. You're strong because you held on. You're strong because you're still here. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, holding her close. But listen to me, Laakia. Suffering in silence isn't strength. Real strength is knowing when to rise, when to defend yourself, and when to say enough. You don't have to fight every battle, but you never let someone strip away your dignity. Laakia clung to her, sobs shaking her frame as the weight of the humiliation she had endured poured out at last. Rhonda rocked her gently, her own throat tightening with emotion. She had fought monsters in cages, endured injuries that would have broken lesser people, but nothing compared to seeing her daughter broken by cruelty she could not yet fend off. She stood finally, helping Laakia to her feet, her arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Rhonda turned once more to face the bullies, her gaze as sharp as shattered glass. This ends today, she said with finality. You will leave her alone. You will learn what respect means. And if you don't, you'll answer to me. They didn't respond. They couldn't. The threat hung in the air like the scent of ozone before a storm, and the truth was clear. They had awakened something they should never have touched. With Laakia leaning against her, Rhonda guided her toward the doors. The fading light poured over them as they stepped out of the gym, the echo of their footsteps leaving behind the stunned silence of those who had thought themselves untouchable. In the hallway, Laakia's breathing steadied little by little, though her voice trembled when she finally spoke. Mom, I feel so small, like they won, like I'm just a joke to them. Rhonda stopped, turning her daughter gently by the shoulders until their eyes met. No, she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of a promise. They didn't win. You're here, you're breathing, and you're still standing. That's victory. But don't mistake endurance for weakness. What they did today shows you something important. You can't keep hiding who you are. You're my daughter. You have my blood. You don't need to fight to prove it, but you will never be a victim again. Laakia's lips trembled, but she nodded, her mother's words pouring into her like steel being forged. She leaned into Rhonda's embrace, whispering, I'll try. Rhonda held her tightly, her eyes hardening as she stared down the empty hallway ahead. You'll do more than try, she said. You'll learn. You'll grow. And the next time someone thinks you're a doll to be tossed around, you'll remind them exactly who you are. As they walked together out of Riverton High, the last rays of sunlight spilling across the parking lot, Laakia felt something stir inside her. The ember that had smoldered for days glowed a little brighter, fueled now not just by humiliation and fear, but by her mother's strength and the knowledge that she was not alone. The bullies had seen her silence, her fragility, her restraint. But now, after what had happened, they had also seen her mother, the storm they had unknowingly provoked. And Riverton High would never see Laakia the same way again. The next morning, Riverton High felt like a different place, though the bricks were the same, the doors the same, and the shrill ring of the bell unchanged. The difference lay in the eyes that followed Laakia Carter through the hallway. No longer were they merely amused glances, casual cruelty hidden behind laughter and whispers. Now they carried something sharper, heavier, curiosity, fear, and in a few of them respect. It spread in low murmurs, carried from locker to locker, class to class, until it reached nearly every corner of the school. The story of what had happened in the gym was everywhere, exaggerated and reshaped into countless versions. Some said the new girl had nearly been strangled. Others said her mother had stormed in like a warrior queen, tossing boys twice her size into the bleachers without breaking a sweat. The truth was already blurred, but one fact could not be denied. Laakia was no longer invisible. She felt it the moment she stepped through the double doors, the weight of attention pressing on her like a cloak. She tried to keep her head down, to walk as though nothing had changed, but whispers chased her down the hallway. "That's her," the one Jake choked out. "No, her mom is Ronda Rousey, like the Ronda Rousey, the UFC champ. No wonder she didn't fight back. She's got it in her blood." Each word struck her differently. Some stung, some warmed, and some left her unsettled. For years she had lived with the promise of silence, the pact she had made with her mother. No attention, no trouble, no fighting. And yet trouble had found her anyway, and now there was no hiding who she was. Brittany was the first to cross her path that morning. Leaning against a locker, phone clutched in her hand, she flashed a smile that was more forced than confident. Her eyes lingered on Laakia with a mix of disdain and unease. "Well, well, the princess of the octagon," she sneered, her tone trying to reclaim the venom that had slipped since yesterday. "Guess you needed mommy to save you." A few of her friends tittered, but the laughter was weak, brittle. Laakia paused, clutching her backpack strap. Meeting Brittany's eyes was something she hadn't shown before. Calm, steady, a trace of steel hidden in her gaze. "I didn't need her," Laakia said quietly, her voice even, though it carried clearly enough to be heard by those nearby. "But I'm glad she was there, because she reminded me of something you'll never understand. Strength isn't about how many people you humiliate. It's about knowing when to protect and when to stand tall." The hallway fell silent around them. Brittany's smirk faltered, her lips parting as though she meant to respond. But no words came. For a heartbeat, she seemed stripped of her armor, exposed. She turned away, flipping her hair over her shoulder, muttering something under her breath. But the damage was done. Her throne, once secure, wobbled under her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shifting tides. Students who had once turned away from Laakia began offering small nods, cautious smiles. A younger girl in the cafeteria whispered, "You're amazing," before darting off with her tray. A boy in her English class leaned over shyly to say, "I'm glad you're okay." Even teachers seemed to look at her differently, their eyes carrying a mixture of sympathy and unspoken questions. But not everyone welcomed the change. Jake was absent, rumors swirling that he'd been benched from practice, his pride more battered than his body. Ethan and Kyle moved through the halls quieter than usual, avoiding direct contact, their laughter muted. And Brittany, though still flaunting her position among the cheerleaders, found her words carrying less weight, her mockery less effective. Laakia herself felt like she was standing at the edge of two worlds. On one side was the quiet girl she had tried to be, small and invisible, clutching her books like a shield. On the other side was the girl her father had trained, the fighter forged in a dojo with years of discipline, the daughter of a champion. She didn't want to fight, didn't want to draw attention, but she could no longer deny that she had been marked by both fate and blood. That evening when she returned home, her mother was already there, waiting at the kitchen table. The air smelled faintly of tea, steam curling from the mug in Rhonda's hands. She looked up when Laakea entered, her expression soft but her eyes still burning with the memory of the previous day. "How was school?" Rhonda asked, her voice gentle but edged with concern. Laakea set her backpack down carefully, her hands lingering on the straps. "Different," she admitted after a moment. "Everyone knows. They know about you. They know what happened." Rhonda nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. That was inevitable. Secrets don't stay secrets forever. She paused, then added, "And, how do you feel about it?" Laakea hesitated. She pulled out a chair, sitting across from her mother, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "I feel exposed, like I can't pretend anymore. They're watching me, Mom. Some are scared, some admire me, but none of them see me as just me. I'm your daughter now, the fighter's daughter, the one they tried to break." Her eyes glistened, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I let them." Rhonda reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand firmly in her own. "No," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. "You didn't let them. You endured them. That's not weakness, Laakea. That's strength. But strength isn't only about survival. It's about choice. And you have a choice now. Do you keep hiding, or do you decide who you're going to be?" Laakea swallowed hard, blinking back the tears threatening to spill. She thought of the gym, of Jake's arm crushing her throat, of Brittany's phone capturing her humiliation. She thought of the moment she had blacked out, the fear that she might never wake again. And she thought of her mother's arms pulling her back, the fire in Rhonda's voice as she stood over the bullies. She drew a slow breath, her chest rising with new resolve. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said quietly. Rhonda's lips curved into a small smile, one that carried pride and relief. "Good. Then it's time you learned what it really means to stand tall." The days that followed were not easy. Rumors continued to swirl, and the bullies did not vanish overnight. Jake returned eventually, his glare seething whenever it landed on Laakea, though he no longer dared confront her directly. Brittany whispered lies in corners, trying to salvage her power, but the cracks in her facade widened with every passing day. Yet something had shifted permanently. Laakea was no longer their easy target. The school had seen too much, and the fear that had once surrounded Jake's group now lingered around them instead. Meanwhile, at home, evenings changed shape. Instead of retreating into silence after homework, Laakea found herself in the training space her mother had set up years ago, but rarely used in front of her. The mat smelled faintly of old sweat and leather, the air filled with echoes of past battles. Rhonda stood across from her daughter, her stance firm, her eyes alight with the same determination she once carried into championship fights. "Show me your guard," Rhonda instructed one night. Laakea raised her hands, her body stiff but willing. "Loosen up," Rhonda corrected gently, stepping forward to adjust her daughter's elbow. "Balance comes from control, not tension. Don't fight the ground, use it." They moved through drills together, slowly at first, then faster as Laakea's instincts reawakened. Muscle memory stirred, techniques she had once practiced under her father's guidance surfacing again like old friends. Her breath grew steadier, her stance surer. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear or shame. She felt capable. Rhonda watched her carefully, pride hidden behind the sharpness of her corrections. She saw her daughter stumble, fall, and rise again. She saw the fire building behind her eyes, the ember catching flame. After one particularly clean escape from a hold, Laakea looked up, her face flushed, her chest heaving, and saw her mother smiling at her. "You see," Rhonda said softly, "you're not just my daughter. You're strong in your own right, and you don't have to prove it to anyone but yourself." Laakea nodded, sweat dripping down her temple, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. For the first time since arriving at Riverton, she felt hope bloom inside her. Not because the bullies had stopped, not because the whispers had faded, but because she no longer felt powerless. She was not the quiet, fragile girl they believed her to be. She was someone who had endured, someone who had chosen to rise, someone who would never again let herself be broken. And as she stood on the mat beside her mother, her body aching but her spirit steady, Lakia knew that this was her new beginning. If this story moved you, don't just stop. Here, hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next jaw-dropping chapter we're about to share. Trust me, tomorrow's video will shake you even more. Click on the next video on your screen and dive into another story that will leave you speechless. And don't keep this moment to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family. You never know who needs to hear it today.